episode of the Best Book Club. I'm your host, Nu Fatora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be discussing Sadistic by cosbyrerun. With me, I have probably the biggest fan I've heard of the story, Hans Gutherson. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, so glad to be back. It doesn't have a ton of views, so maybe I'm like one of the only fans of the story before OnlyFans was a thing, and I just read it like 15,000 times. That's also possible.
I
I
mean,
don't hear people talking about it, but it's underrated. And again, like we've talked about many times, like if you weren't on Lucky Fish forums and the story came out in like 2012, if you
yep.
weren't around then, if you weren't reading stories then, you're gonna miss all this good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad we get to revisit some of these. I think of like hidden gems now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're alone in liking it, and there's many people that I've talked to have said that Cosby Rerun is a fantastic writer and inspiration for them. So
Mm-hmm.
I think you're just one of the most vocal about your like for the story.
Nice.
So I'd like to preface this episode with a little something. Yeah, while going through it, I ended up taking a pretty hard stance against it. And you'll hear that through my critiques and notes. And I'm hoping, Hans, that you'll be able to change my mind on it and prove wrong why all my points are incorrect.
Cool. I'm excited. Yeah, and maybe you'll sway me, and I'll re-examine. I'll say, you know what? Was I was just being sadistic in my like, and then we'll be able to plug the title of the story.
Yeah,
Although the story kind of has three titles, which is a bit interesting in itself. But yeah, no, I'm excited to
yeah,
hear everything you have to say, and we'll see what we can talk about. Always fun, lively discussions here on the
yeah.
Best Book Club.
Absolutely. And so, to give a summary, this story centers on a hedonistic college freshman recounting some of the formative experiences in her sexual exploration. I think it can be pretty much summed up in that one sentence. That seems
Yeah,
like the very core idea of it.
it's
So,
true. Yeah, and I love that you said hedonistic. Good callback
yep,
to last episode where we went a lot into hedonism. It
yeah,
feels like it pairs really well with blood money in a lot of ways. Like talking about blood money, and this one, programming wise, it feels like there's a lot that they're hitting on that feels similar. I think we'll get into some of that as we go.
yeah, definitely. And so this story was first posted on October 3rd, 2012 on Lucky Fetish, and it has almost 16,000 views to date.
Hmm.
What about this story has captured you and stuck in your mind for so long? I don't think you've ever missed an opportunity to bring it up and say it's one of your favorites. Why has it stuck with you for so long?
Yeah, great question and good place to start us off from. It's not going to be any surprise to your listeners, and they're probably going to get bored of hearing me go on about some of these points. But for me, the story is such a fascinating analysis of the fetish. It reads interestingly as I was going back through it, like a very well written true story, like what we really hope for in like the true story section. But what we typically get in the history of forums is very lame. Like I gave a wedgie and it hurt. Like the stuff we joke about, the
Yeah.
parody stuff of fictional stories. That's typically the fare of our true stories. But I find interestingly, and this may just be anecdotally, we really do crave good, well written, true stories. Like we want to know something's real. I don't know why that is, and I don't know if that's universally true. But I found especially even on DeviantArt, stories that pretend to be true but very clearly aren't, get bonkers numbers and do very well on DeviantArt. And it's very clear there's some demand for like stories that are true and seem realistic, but aren't. And this feels like in the way it so deeply examines the fetish from even how it sets up like this is exactly what I like in the wedgies. This is exactly what I want to see and how I view it and how it's negative and Like they even cite, and I love this, they even cite the DSM diagnostic
Mm-hmm.
manual. And you know what's awesome? The page they give in the story is accurate. If you look up the DSM 4, page
Hmm.
574, that is the page for sexual sadism. I
Hmm.
love that. One of the few stories ever that includes like a citation or a reference in it,
Yeah.
which I think is great. It's very rare for us to do that. Obviously, we're not an academically focused like community of writers. I did it in a story. I had like 6 footnotes in one I wrote. A story called "Thinking About." And it's in my collection "Why We Wedgie" and other stories that came out in 2017. So I think that was partly because inspired by that, but I didn't even remember they had that little reference. But really, to sort of sum up and stop rambling, it is how deep the examination of the fetish is. For me, of course, as you know, coming onto the board like 2011, around there when it starts, seeing this story, I feel seen. I feel
Hmm.
understood. I feel like, wow, here's a great analysis of what it means to be a fetishist. It's not just characters giving wedgies. It's I'm getting psychology. I'm getting this is who I am. This is what drives me, and these are the lengths we'll go to get what we want. And we don't really see that in stories much, and we see it, I think, done very beautifully, very powerfully in this one.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I like all that. And I think the reason why we look for such depth and detail in true stories is because wedgies really are not a very common thing, and especially
Mm.
to so many of us, it might never even happen, or happen so infrequently. And so, getting as much detail about everything that's happening and what's going on in the scenario, it really helps give the full context and help visualize what's going on so that we can try and put ourselves in those situations.
Mm-hmm. I
You know,
like that.
it was interesting because I picked up on the DSM as well. Um, and for anybody who doesn't know, the DSM is now DSM 5 is the most recent one.
Yep, that's right.
I was trying to find if when the latest DSM comes out, if that invalidates the other ones. Um, but everything that comes up is that all of the results just say that they're either questioning the validity of the DSM in general, or that it's unscientific, or that you can't put any stock in it. So
Yeah,
it's a
it's
little,
interesting.
yeah.
That's interesting. I know if you take any psychology course, I know at least from the little bit I did. Like I mentioned this to you, I think randomly, in other podcasts. Like I took a psychology course in high school. That was it for me, psychology. But the DSM was like the Bible. It was like you always mentioned it. It was like the go-to thing. It came up all the time, and apparently, in my sort of like pseudo research into the fetish as I was doing it over the years, trying to like, do I write some kind of academic paper? Do I write some essay on wedgie fetish? It keeps coming up, and it's like everybody's talking about the DSM, and it's always cited. So yeah, it's a good question though. Like, would if you looked at like five, which I didn't do, how would that info on like sexual sadism gel with like what Cosby Rerun is talking about when he talks about like the fourth volume, which it feels
Right.
like he's inspired by. So like just over time, and it opens up a fascinating digression, I think, just in like when we're talking about like the psychology of the fetish, which Sadistic is very much interested in. Like, how does what we know about that psychology change over time because of other scientists and researchers and psychologists like dictating what it means
Right.
and what is okay. Like, obviously, the page they link to in Sadistic and what really the DSM is interested in is these criteria of like, do you have a fetish,
Mm-hmm.
or a paraphilia is the technical term, and there's specific criteria like if you have fascinations for longer than 6 months is one I remember. So like, what if they decide no, 6 months is okay? Now it's 7 months, and like, how much like does that change what it means to be a fetishist? So it's interesting how much of this is maybe constructed, and I think Sadistic kind of plays with that a bit too.
Hmm, that's interesting. Um, I'm curious that I'm looking up if there's a difference. Okay, Psychology Today, I guess doesn't really help, but I guess I'll if I find out anything about that, I'll bring it up later. Um, but to go into the story, the opening is heavy with
Yes, yes, yeah.
description about a single
Oh yeah.
character and leaves no room for the reader to fill in gaps, which draws me out a little because I enjoy having a light description, maybe a few
Mm,
descriptors or adjectives, and so I can't really engage right away.
sure.
And
Yeah.
I think the difference here is that you really love how direct it is, and I love indirectness.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, certainly. I mean, it's funny to think, like in my own writing, how I'll go without giving you literally any description of what a character looks like, or is wearing, or what the world around them looks like. But I look at this and I'm like, wow. And as readers, like 15,000 views, almost 16,000, like you said, on a story that's like something like 25,000 words or something, I think was what I was able to see. It's not super long, not wasn't continued for very long or anything like that. I think there's something about being able to picture her so clearly that I think does appeal to people, and I think as readers we do want some idea of what they look like. I think Cosby Rerun goes overboard, but I also think that's deliberate. Like we know kind of early on it moves from this third person to first person perspective where Haley's talking about herself. But even the third person perspective just feels like Haley again. Like it's this really interesting play of like, is Haley like a god looking down on herself? Because she's just describing how perfect she is. And that's exactly what she's doing later. And it's like, what? So I'm there's maybe something there in why he's breaking her down and explaining her in such detail. Obviously, it's so like we can better visualize her, but it's like literally so much detail about all like everything from the way she's talking to how her legs are smooth and creamy and like all this like very interesting descriptions about how perfect she is. And I mean, it definitely kind of you could argue maybe it's like it's a bit much, but maybe that's the point. It's to kind of get you like, what is going on? Like, where's my anchor? Like, where's my port in the storm? And then we get uh Haley who comes in and says, "Okay, there's no more description about what I look like. We're past that. We're going deeper, and we're gonna talk about my psychology, and I'm not gonna hold back. I'm gonna give you another huge amount of detail and content, but it's about something that maybe tells you more and is maybe more important." So I wonder if that's almost like a take on how a lot of us writers and the fetish in general, and I think you might have seen this looking through a lot of the old Lucky Fetish stories, you get like a sentence or two about what they look like, and then we're right into the action, right into the wedgies.
Hmm.
We don't get like, here's my deep psychological like profile,
Yeah.
which you kind of get in like a Blood Money, although it's more subtly laid out than like a Sadistic, where it's like, this is my DSM page. If you want to know all my symptoms, it's like very different approach
Yeah.
to the same sort of idea of like, who am I? How does the fetish affect my life? Which, you know, for me is obviously a big question. And I love when stories like try to answer it in some
Right.
ways.
Yeah. Well, and even like the dialogue Cosby Rerun gives Haley feels like it's also driving home that detail and description. And in
Mm,
my mind, it could have easily not been dialogue. And
sure.
basically,
Yeah.
I'm just confused as to why it's dialogue when there is mystique as to what she's talking about. It would work much better as thoughts. It's also
Yeah.
extremely self aware and reads like she's speaking directly
Yeah.
to the audience and telling me specifically about herself in an expository way rather than just
Yeah.
thinking out loud. Like, even before she starts
Yeah.
typing out her thoughts in a document for the world to see, when she's just
Yeah.
thinking out loud, that's what it feels like.
Yeah. It's sus. It's suspicious. Then that's why I mentioned, like, weirdly, the story has three titles. He calls it Sadistic at the top. After he does a brief intro, he calls it The Confessions of a Gorgeous Pseudo Sadist, which is a fascinating title. And then he goes on and he writes Haley Jamie Howard's Confession. So we have three titles to the same story. And we have to ask ourselves, like, who is the author of all of these? And I think what we're kind of hitting on is maybe it's Haley all the way through. Like, she says she's a liar. That's her first words. And whenever they tell you that in a story, it's problematic because you could literally just say, "All right, we can't trust anything. She said she's a liar." The end, which I kind of lean towards, but isn't particularly productive when you want to talk about a story. But I think what we can maybe extract from it, is like this prologue in the beginning is Haley trying to paint a picture, trying to be like, oh, this is a removed narrator, when in reality, she's trying to paint herself as someone who wasn't totally responsible for whatever mysterious event happened that I don't even think we've seen yet in the story, right? And by the time it ends, like, I don't think anything that bad that she's going to have remorse for has even occurred. Although I might be wrong on that. So I think it's Haley's voice all the way through. I think she's trying to, maybe without seeming as pretentious, talk about how perfect she is in the beginning and then go into it a bit more subtly when the actual quote unquote confession starts. And she's like, I'm smart, I'm beautiful, but she's not using the same, I'm so perfect, I have smooth skin and all this stuff, which would be kind of creepy and maybe put us off her a bit. But I think she's trying to, like, be manipulative with us and play with us as readers. But I think we can kind of cut through it, which I like.
With the her Haley calling herself beautiful and all that, there's so
Yeah.
much repetition beating readers
Mm.
over the head that, as one of the things, for example, this girl is beautiful and she knows it, therefore we have to know it. After the first two
Mm.
or three times Haley states that she's beautiful or attractive, I felt a growing thought of annoyance come up, like,
Yes.
yeah, I get it, she's attractive, can we talk about something else?
Yeah. Can we get to the wedgies, please?
Not even
Yeah.
the
I
wedges, just
understand you
something
completely.
besides her describing
Something
how
else.
beautiful she
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. It's interesting. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the movie American Psycho, the film,
Oh,
Patrick
really?
Bateman. Because here we have, and I'm not a big fan of the movie, um, but I understood what it was going for, and I think the same thing applies here. In American Psycho, it's like a critique and satire of a very specific culture focused on vanity and capitalism and all that, what you lose when you're focused on that. And I think Haley is kind of like that. I think Haley is so self obsessed, and she's like a critique on these sorts of people who are like, my beauty is the most important thing about me. And because I think I'm beautiful and because I say I am, I automatically am. And you must hear this in 100 different ways because it's the most important part about me. So I feel like that's what they're going for. And I think what we quickly learn about Haley is, like, that's not even like relevant. Like, she's talking about how she's got this super high IQ, and we start to realize like how much of what she's telling us is a lie, because she straight up tells us she's a liar. Like, is she that beautiful? But also, how much is she just creating some kind of identity? How much is she making herself the perfect girl in her own story? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you could even look at this and you could wonder, and that's what I was hinting at earlier. This idea that because she literally starts the story saying, "I am a liar," we could look at this and ask, how much of this is actually real, how much actually happens, and how much is she just like a desperate girl who wishes she was more beautiful, would get in these crazy hot wedgie fantasies and get to live something that's true when really it's all imagined and in her mind sort of stuff. You know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
it makes you think about it. At
Hmm.
least made me think about it. I totally get though, like as you say, there's so much stuff that's there. It can be hard to like get immersed in it, but kind of stepping back from the story, I find like there's these layers that you can look at, like threads in the underwear, and you gotta kind of like pull them apart and think like what depth is there to this character that she's maybe trying to make us gloss over as readers and make us
Hmm.
just focus on this idea she's beautiful when really there's more and we got to think about it. Same as exactly like with her whole idea of like the three intros to the story, basically three different like titles. It's like I feel like Haley, you're just telling this, but you don't want us to know it. You're trying to trick us,
Hmm.
but we're not gonna be fooled that easy. And we want the wedgies. Bring them on.
Hmm.
You know.
That's a very interesting analysis of it. I hadn't thought of that before. That's definitely something I'll have to sit on. I mean, I kind of I can see a little bit of the American Psycho type thing, um, but there is a lot more of just Patrick Bateman focusing on his routine and how he maintains himself, as opposed to
Yeah.
like the actual focusing on the superficiality of and like what people do to maintain it, as opposed to what Haley
Yeah.
does is talking continuously about herself and all that. But yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
It's interesting though how performative, how obviously everybody loves the opening scenes of American Psycho where he's preparing his whole
do they really?
routine of getting ready and he talks about like, and he's and the same thing in American Psycho, which bugs me, is he starts off saying, "I do 500 sit-ups or whatever he
Right.
says," and I instantly check out of the film because I'm like, "There's no human being who's gonna do that. You're a liar. I can't trust anything you say going forward." And the movie reinforces that, where like we don't know what's real. He's blowing up cars at the end of the movie,
Yeah.
and you're like, in the book, as I understand it, is supposed to be way more ambiguous, like in a good way. You don't know what's real,
Right.
what's not. The movie, it's kind of like very clearly because it goes so far beyond. You look at this and you're like, this is clearly like I have to take this as satire. I have to look at this as like just critiquing this culture and being so over the top, and I think that's kind of similar in some veins with Haley. This
Uh huh.
this performance, this appearance focus, this talk, which he does do about certain topics that are kind of niche in American Psycho. She does about herself, and she does about the fetish and psychology in very deep ways. So they feel like obviously very different, obviously, but I feel like obviously the movie comes out 12 years ahead of this. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. I think Cosby Rerun might have seen it,
Hmm.
taken some inspiration maybe.
Huh. That's interesting. I mean, I thought American Psycho was all right. I definitely my favorite part of it was Willem Dafoe. I thought he had the
Yeah,
best by far of all of them, but
he's the best.
it
I
was
love
the
Willem
rest of the
Dafoe.
movie was all right. I didn't particularly care
Yeah.
for it too much.
So you and me can get along. If you said you loved it, we'd have a problem, right?
It was good, but it's not, I don't think I'd watch it again.
Yeah,
Um,
same.
so we had we have Haley being super repetitive about her describing
Mm,
herself, but then there's
yeah.
Cosby Rerun using repetition while writing. And this here is an example of this. Haley lets out yet another sigh. The sound of that sigh makes her
Mm.
sound so weary, as if she's lived 1,000 years. The sigh makes her sound as if she is so weary that she might collapse at any time. And this continues on
Jeez.
over and over and over throughout the story. Like at one point,
Yeah.
when we get to um, the scene with, I can't remember her name, her friend, the first one that she wedgies. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I know. Yeah, I know what you
I
mean. Yep.
didn't keep track of how many times he said the word, but he must have said couch at least 15 times in 3 paragraphs. It
Yeah.
is like it's one thing if it's like a one-off thing, or it's like a little bit there but not much, but it's so in your face. I can't ignore it. It's so hard to get around.
Yeah, that definitely takes you out of it, and there's
Yes.
not much like to defend about repetition. He's also of the anti-cherry school of exclamation marks, loves exclamation marks, and there's many, and it's like because I'm like a journalist by trade, we're trained like don't ever
Right.
use them unless it's like the most important crazy thing ever. Like you don't need them, and I mean
Yeah.
you keep using them, they lose their power, which
Yeah.
is what happens and you're like, she like every single so many senses of exclamation marks. Yeah. I mean we could play games and try and guess like, oh maybe the repetition is some
Right.
deeper meaning around trying to hit some ideas home, but sometimes it's like you don't have another word for it. And you want to talk about how they're on the couch, and that's something as writers we got to be careful of. It's easy to slip. We have our like what's the word, pet words we might lean on, or
Hmm.
expressions and things. um I like how like the story feels like it could be more repetitive in some ways because there's themes around lust and how insatiable it is. And I'm glad like it doesn't keep
Yeah.
going over and over on that. But words like beautiful, obviously in the beginning, are used constantly, as you pointed out, like tons of times in the first like post that they make, and it's like, and it comes up a bit more later on. It's interesting that we don't see it come up much later, which I think maybe speaks to this idea we're moving beyond it
Yeah.
and we're moving into deeper territory. But it's definitely a fair critique if we're nitpicking to be like, you gotta change up your word choice.
Yeah, I think it comes down to it, the opening being entirely direct detail. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Cosbyrerun is either afraid of readers not getting what he's writing, or doesn't believe in the intelligence of his audience and feels he has to lay everything in the open so nobody misses
Mm.
anything. And
That could be it.
I think
Yeah,
it
could be.
goes, it starts to go away once other characters come into the picture. So now that he has
Yeah.
something else to work with, I think he's able to let the story flow.
Mm.
Yeah.
I like that. I think that's cool. I know for me in some early stories I wrote, I was just it was like the opposite of what you pointed out, which I think is a very good reason some writers avoid like this indirect detail and these characterizations through dialogue or actions. It's because like as you point out, they're scared people aren't going to get it or they're not going to pick up on it,
Hmm.
or it's like if you were me, a young me, it's like I'm so smart. I have to put literally everything down to show how
Right.
smart I am. I have to point out how this action says exactly this thing, and that's a throwback to that, and it's a message about this meaning of life. And it's like people are gonna get it.
Yep.
Like they are. And I slowly started to get that as I went, but certainly like when you have so much like detail about this is who Haley is, this is exactly who I am. And we can read into it and we can say, is that really how she is? And I think that's what we're invited to do. But from like a glance, from like that surface level reading, certainly it's like, can't you just like start doing stuff and I can put this picture together? Is one I think takeaway readers can have. I think when they're reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not gonna harp on this point for too much longer, but I have a little bit more to go
Yeah,
on the direct detail. And like
sure.
I said before, the direct detail continues throughout. It does lessen as more characters and events come into the picture, but it continues throughout. And after just a little bit of it, I felt pretty bored waiting for any kind of indirect detail or something to happen so I could actually engage with the story rather than have it talk at me.
Fascinating. I love them.
And as an
That's great.
example, I pulled a lot of quotes from this story as an example of
Hmm.
direct detail and repetition. This passage exemplifies it. I was attracted to her, and I still am. She was included in a lot of my fantasies. I was always too scared to actually wedgie her because I thought she'd somehow know that I did it for a sexual reason, the same reason I never wedgied any girl. For some reason, I was afraid that she'd see something in my behavior that would be easily decipherable to her. After this happened, she'd probably never speak to me again and tell everyone my fetish. Other people finding out that I was into giving other girls wedgies was a huge fear of mine, so I didn't want to risk anything. And so I that
Yeah,
part, and really
I know what you mean. Yeah.
so many other times of the story, I lost track of how many times I said obviously out loud, with how often Cosbyrerun would state something and then
Mm.
unnecessarily explain it. It's
Yeah.
especially bad when, after going to great lengths describing Katie's positive personality, he then
Yeah.
describes her sarcastic and bitter side, closing it out with, quote, "This side of her personality is so different from how she normally is." No shit.
Mm.
uh,
Yeah. It's fascinating. I mean, it becomes a much harder story to write if you're trying to communicate a lot of deep like not problematic, but deep and like difficult ideas and concepts, like this idea that she's always too scared to give a wedgie because you're afraid that they're going to see that darkness inside of you. And we call it darkness, we could just call it sexual drive, to see those urges and understand where they come from. And that's a real fear for many
Absolutely.
of us fetishists, I think, and a key one. And it's insightful and kind of wonderful that they hit on it. But certainly, yeah, it would have been interesting if there was some way for them to communicate that without just writing it all out. I don't know how exactly you do that because it is like really abstract concepts, and that seems to be a lot of what the story is interested in.
Right.
These high level, up in the air ideas and communicating them to us. Some of us reading it will be the first time we're thinking about any of this at this level, but certainly like from even the example you brought up is a good one of just like there's some repetition there. Like
Mm-hmm.
we get that it's a fear. She already said it was a fear. She's just kind of repeating it. So yeah, no, it's a good point you bring
Yeah.
up. Like there's a totally different story that could be written here, all about this character showing this fear without telling us, or only slightly, or maybe even just through dialogue, because that's a fine way to show something and not
Mm-hmm.
tell it. In some ways, the best way, but kind
Yeah.
of difficult to do. Because if you're like me, that just turns into monologues where people say all this exposition where they should not be doing
Yeah.
that. So yeah, but I think it's a good point, and I'd love to read like Sadistic 2 Indirect Detail is what it should be called, and it's all about what a story looks like if it's a bit more of a subtle examination of these questions,
Yeah.
maybe, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the example I brought up of the fear, I think it was I think it was well done until he had to say other people finding out that I was into giving other girls wedgies was a huge fear of mine. That was completely unnecessary explanation,
Sure.
because he had
Yeah.
already stated 3 times before that she
Yeah.
was afraid of people
That's a
finding
good
out.
point. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Something else that to keep going down my list of
Yeah.
critiques. It seems like Cosby is in love with adjectives in this story, using them for every
Mm.
single noun and adverbs.
Yeah.
It was got a little annoying after a while to me. So, going along with my previous point about
I
self-aware
guess just from that,
dialogue.
are you
Oh,
talking
sure.
about like adverbs? Like adverbs, like if they say like smooth, silky skin, like that kind of stuff, silky words, like that kind of stuff,
It
like
was
adverbs? Is that what we're talking
adverbs
about?
and adjectives. Like, if any
Gotcha.
sort of noun that would come up, there was an adjective attached to it to describe it, rather than just, even if it had already been given an adjective prior, he used the exact same adjective again later on.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Um, so, going along with my previous point about self-aware dialogue, Haley's thoughts are also self aware to the point of absurdity, in my opinion. She's able to describe in exact terms every little detail about herself and why she has it. She's 19 at the most, at the latest point in the story, and at that age, nobody knows who they really are and what they want. We've just become adults, and there is
True.
so much to decipher that I find it impossible that she'd be this self aware. Like the
Sure.
DSM thing and all this stuff that she describes about herself. It, and
Yeah.
I could maybe see it as coming from her intelligence. But the only reason we know Haley is intelligent is because she's told us, and some of the
Mm.
vocabulary she uses. We never see anything throughout the entire story actually showing her intelligence. The picture I was able to glean of her from the entire story is supremely narcissistic and
Yeah.
insanely horny. That's it.
Yeah, what a great combo too. My type of woman. Yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, like I don't want to keep harping on this, and I'll try not to after this. But like when she starts the story saying I'm a liar, it's like how much of this is like written way after the fact. And I mean, I guess when we start the story with the original intro, it feels like something's just happened, something she regrets and is remorseful about, and the way she talks is very over the top. Where she says stuff like remorse will make you atone. I'm not the girl who's going to fix everything for everyone. It's like, what is that? Where is that coming from? What is
Yeah.
that about? Especially because she doesn't really talk like that later, and characters talk more cartoony as we go along. Um, there's stuff all I can suspend my disbelief about. Like I was aware about like the DSM and elements of the fetish and psychology at a younger age.
Yeah.
Not super young, but probably at around like what her age would have been when she's writing this. But certainly like the way she goes on and she tells us she's smart and the way she's able to like pull out points, I think is a good hint. She is smart, but she's also trying to manipulate us. I
Mm.
think is what it comes down to. She's trying to paint this picture of herself as not a villain. She goes way over the top in my opinion at the beginning to point out how she's not like a rapist, which was
Yeah.
unnecessary, and all this stuff, and it's trying to like create a and construct this
Yeah.
identity
She
that
wouldn't
we're
have
to
to
take
if she
throughout the
wasn't.
rest of the story. Yeah, yeah, that's fair point. Fair argument. Um, so yeah, I think there's something to be said
Hmm.
around like how much of any of this in the story is really her and real events. And I can't separate that question from my mind when we're
Hmm.
thinking about any
Right.
of this. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to, so I don't just keep saying, "Oh, but maybe none of it's real," which isn't very helpful. But I feel like that's maybe part of what we're talking about. This idea that like she's crafting the story, including stuff, changing other things, making herself seem smarter. Like in the writing of this, it might not be some free writing experiment, stream of consciousness where it's just coming. Maybe she's someone who's had to look at every word and find other examples of how to say this so she sounds smarter.
Hmm.
Maybe that's where the story goes, and we realize in the end, like I said, she's not beautiful. She's
Hmm.
not smart. These things haven't happened
Hmm.
to her, but she's writing like a really interesting story where they
Yeah.
do, and she gets to live out these fantasies,
Hmm.
And so it's trying to pull out what might be real about her, and it's up to you, Nuff, to say I maybe found something real, a kernel of who she really is in this,
Right.
beyond the beauty focus, beyond the way she talks and her quote unquote intelligence. Like, who is she really, and what is her struggles, and why should I care?
Hmm.
And the story might not do it for you, and because it's a very different approach,
Yes.
but it's one of the only stories that kind of asks us to look for that in a
Yeah.
character,
Hmm.
either because we either get stories that give it to us and say here's the character, here's what they look like and some tropes about them, as we've talked about that approach. Or it is like on the other side, here's a character who's fleshed out, who has some angles, and they're going through an arc, and you do get some more indirect detail. That's kind of the ideal, but they're rare, or obviously. And this one feels like it's in this weird middle gray ground where you really have to like figure her out for yourself. And she doesn't make it easy, Haley. She
Hmm.
really could have made it easier on us,
Yeah.
but it's a challenge, and I wonder if how much of that's like deliberate from Cosby Rerun's perspective. They want us thinking about the story and who Haley is as a voice.
I mean, I think that is a pretty fair point to bring up. Is that right off the bat, Haley describes herself as a liar, so it
Yeah,
does throw into question the validity of the rest of the story, and that's
exactly.
that's one of the most explicit examples I can think of in any stories where that's a defining rule of that universe. That's
Yeah,
she's a liar. So it could be all of this is just bullshitted, and
it's true.
so it's
Yeah.
a fair point to bring up, and it's not one I thought about before. I didn't really give it much thought before you brought it up. So
I can't
that
not
it
think
could.
about it, which is annoying. It's because there's some, it's, even when movies or stories they play with that, and we
Mm-hmm.
move from like, oh, this thing you thought was real was like a vision and it wasn't real. I'm sitting there like, so how do I know the whole thing wasn't a vision?
Exactly.
How do I know? Like, if you're gonna play with something like that, like you instantly open it up. And that's happened with movies, and I come out of them like an American Psycho. I watched that, like, I really wish you had made it more ambiguous if it was real or not. Not in like a, he's clearly a liar, so I can't buy any of this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing. When you start Sadistic and you say I'm a liar, it's like, okay, now everything you say I'm gonna take with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Do I disregard everything and say you're a liar, you're lying to me? Do I cherry pick what I like? Or which I can do. Do I toss it all out? Do I say, oh, maybe you're a liar, but you're not lying here. You're not lying to me because I'm the reader and you're being honest. There's different ways to look at it, but it always, in my mind, is going to open up that question, and
Yeah.
it makes it problematic. And I don't know how you get around that as a writer
Mm-hmm.
if you want to show that they're lying. I mean, the obvious thing is like if you reveal at the end they were an unreliable narrator or something, and it's a twist, and you're like, "Oh, surprise! I was lying to you." Instead of setting it up like that, so we're expecting it. But I mean, it's tricky
Yeah.
it because even when I was younger, I would see stuff. And I would watch it, and they would be like, "It was all a dream." And at first, I was so offended by that whole idea away my narrative. You ruined it. Why do I care about
Yeah.
what happened? The whole thing didn't matter. What I slowly grew into understanding is like it's the cliche. It's not the destination. It's the
Exactly.
journey. Like the kids, I won't even mention this because it's kind of underage content. So there's an example of it. I won't even go there. But I would and I would be furious, and I would be like in an episode, I'd be like, "How dare you do that?" But then I realized like, so maybe like in Sadistic, I gotta get past that and say, doesn't matter. Maybe some stuff's lying. The story's not over, so it's hard to know where it would have went.
Right.
And if you these questions about what she's lying about, blah 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 blah, and just say like, "Okay, what happened?" And maybe look at it through that lens of like, if she's a liar, what truth can we still take from it? What is the truth of this character? Maybe
Right.
most important. Well,
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword when
it is.
you have to handle
Well
very
said.
very carefully. And it's kind of a
Yeah,
funny
well said.
expression to me in general, double-edged sword, because pretty much I don't know of a single sword that doesn't have two edges to it.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean,
But it's yeah,
do
it gets.
katanas have two edges? Are they
No, that's
one?
that's one that's one edge.
That's
That's
one.
true.
So there's some
Yeah,
out there, but in most typical, they're gonna
yeah,
have two if they're gonna be effective.
yeah.
So yeah, it's a
But
fair,
yeah,
fair point.
I mean, really,
Yeah,
the one story that comes to mind uh, of something that works really well with that I'm a liar, so why would you believe anything else about it? Is Bleach.
yeah.
Like Eisen.
Okay,
Eisen.
interesting.
He reveals once he reveals that he's actually evil, and I believe it's Hitsugaya who confronts him during the Fake Karakura Town arc.
Spoiler alerts, by the way, for who hasn't read
Oh
Bleach, I
yeah,
imagine.
that's one of the biggest things in all of manga and anime is that reveal, and
Okay.
the what I'm describing now, um, is a Hitsugaya. I think he confronts him during then, and he doesn't believe what Aizen's saying at all, and or maybe it was Ichigo, one of them, um, right? They don't believe what Aizen's saying at all, and they believe what he said before, but Aizen says, well, if you don't believe what I'm saying now, why would you put any stock in what I said before? Something along those lines.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and then of course the probably surpassing uh, the the chip scene in Death Note is Aizen, the panel of Aizen saying, "When were you under the impression that I wasn't using it?" When he's talking about when he's questioned by Hitsugaya about when he activated his blade. Um,
Interesting.
it, that that is the probably the most memed of all
Yeah.
panels. Do you know the panel that I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about because I feel like I've seen like memes of it and jokes and like I feel like, but I could be wrong. YouTubers like Caleb City and Sung One who do like anime parodies. I feel like I've seen that approach in some of their videos.
Yeah.
So it's like it's funny like how it's like how do you know I did this thing? Is it real? Like what if I say it's not real? And like what I win, like the end. Like
Right.
it's like the kids playing and it's like, "Oh, I shot you with my fake gun." No, you didn't. And it's like
Yeah.
that. It's like
Completely wrecking the
what is
improv.
real? What is like what is actual reality that we can agree upon? Like crazy deep. We're going so deep philosophically and like the nature of reality.
Right.
But I think sadistic in its own very micro way is that it's like we're getting a reality of this character, one that we can maybe think, if you're me, is very constructed, very crafted for a certain audience, who she's very aware of and wants to present herself in this certain light. It's almost like it's a dude who's trying to catfish us and be like, I'm a very beautiful woman. I'm going to know how beautiful I am many times so you're
Mm-hmm.
attracted to me. I'm also very smart. And now let me tell you about the very hot wedgie scenes I had. And you're like,
Yeah.
whoa, I'm going to sub to that OnlyFans. Um, I feel like that's kind of what's going on here. So that's why I keep harping on this idea that like if the story were to continue, I wouldn't be surprised, and I like this idea that like, oh, that hot girl Haley and her confessions. I'm a dude, and I wrote that. It was hot. Like the end.
Yeah.
Probably piss some people off and probably annoy them. Cause how do you like go back in the story, right? If you're like, this is a
Yeah.
dude talking to me, like it's weird, you know. But
Yeah.
um, even if it's probably better for readers is if it's like a girl who's like read a lot of these kinds of stories and is like, here's my take on it. I'm gonna hit on the tropes of how beautiful they are and how intelligent and how they're so manipulative and steps ahead and then I'm gonna craft that into a really like taut story sort of thing.
Yeah. And that's yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. It's a tough balance to figure out. Um, and the only way to figure it out really is to just to experiment and try different things.
Yeah, we
Um,
could ask Cosby Rerun. We say, "Yo, what's the deal? Was it real? Was she a liar? How are you gonna end that story?" Then we
yeah.
get an answer, or if not, we have to speculate wildly about the nature of this character's reality and how much of it is honest, and if we can pull out something real from what might not be.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of the nature of unfinished stories. Is we
Mm,
don't know
yeah,
what happens, so it could easily go in a completely opposite direction than we think. But
yeah,
there's no way to know that.
it's true.
So to bring it back into the actual story, the story that Katie tells Haley, that was her name. I forgot it, but I remember it now. The story that Katie tells Haley about the first wedgie she saw is pretty conveniently exactly what gets
Yes.
Haley off. And Katie tells it in ridiculously insane, in
Oh
depth
yeah.
detail. It's
Yeah.
so hard to believe she'd remember
Never would
so
happen.
much
Yep.
of what happened down to minute details that really shouldn't have stuck in her mind, like the
No.
exact ways that people moved and exactly what they said.
Yeah.
It's
Would never happen.
for the purpose of
Never.
the story, it works, but for the
Yeah.
purposes of it actually
It's
happening, it doesn't
fantasy.
make any
It's
sense.
so fantasy. No, I mean I've tried personally to have people tell me stories or recall them or things like that, wedgie stories, and always it's just like, oh, I think there was a wedgie and it felt good or it hurt or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. It's like, no, I need all the details.
Yeah.
That's what I'm reading. Same thing, and characters are like, there was a wedgie, and I'm like, you need to tell me everything. Like I need to be able to picture this in my mind. But if you're not a fetishist, or if you're not some kind of insane photographic memory storyteller, which we don't have reason to think Katie is,
No.
there's no reason her story should be anywhere near that detailed. Like, it would be interesting if we had Haley pushing for more and more
Yeah.
detail and how awkward that would become as she tries to, but ultimately fails over and over again to deliver enough detail. Because it's not going to be enough. You're going to get probably turned on by a story, but it's not going to be enough for her. We know that as fetishists. Haley's probably should figure that out in the story. It would be cool if she starts to realize that, and that's when her drive, her libido, as anime pennies would call it, takes over, and she's got to go and give her one to
Mm-hmm.
satisfy it.
Wow.
But certainly, like it's where it falls into one of those realms of realism we're gonna get into, which is
Yep.
not very realistic.
Yeah, I think it's what you said about it is it's reflected. The way we remember stories is reflected in the true stories that have been posted on Lucky Fetish. It,
Yeah.
there's not much in the way of detail. That's how people remember stories.
Yep.
But I really like what you said, like how it could have been. I think that would have been so much better for prying for details in the manipulative way that she is. That would have been really
Yeah.
good,
Would have been cool.
and
Would have been
that would
cool.
have
And I mean, the dream is to your point. We get those super detailed, true
right,
stories. We
right,
can read it, and you get all those details. You never get it. That's why the better the true story, the more likely it is that's fake,
yeah,
in my opinion. It's
yeah,
just the rule that I came
yep,
up with years ago, and I haven't thought of in a long time because I haven't looked at, and there hasn't been on Lucky Fish forums, for example, true stories coming up with any frequency. Um, but truly, the better they are, the less likely they're real, and
yeah,
it's like a sliding scale.
mm-hmm.
And I mean, like I noted, people love and they want those true, quote unquote, true stories, but they need to be good and detailed. And it was Powerful Blossom, 85, who got huge numbers off of like this girlfriend sister wedgie series of stories, and it was about a character. And to me, it was pretty clear they were fictional, not only because they were very good, but just like a lot of other factors. I was like, there's no way this is real. And the writer, Powerful Blossom 85, is giving his girlfriend's sister a bunch of hot wedgies. But readers really thought it was real. And they would message and leave in comments on his DA page all about how what he was doing was wrong for giving this person a wedgie and put like, and because they were like putting their sexual needs on them
Mm-hmm.
without consent,
Yeah,
right? Which is a good point.
yeah,
So they got so much of that that they took down the stories and deleted them. And in my mind, it was very clear that they weren't real stories, that they were fictional. And they wrote some others that were like that. It's like, oh, they write a lot of fictional stories that are good, but it seemed too real, and they liked that, but it's also problematic. So I mean, it's a clear example there of like there's this great demand for stories like that feel really real, and that's what I think Cosby Rerun is trying to capture in this one. Um, but obviously, like, how do you make it good and really real? I don't know if you
Right.
can bridge that. I don't
Yeah, I
know if
don't know.
anybody can bridge that. Because you're right. The more real it gets, the more you're gonna forget. The more someone who's not a fetishist is gonna be telling it,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not gonna be capturing all these details. And it's like that's real, but is it entertaining? Is it
Right.
good? And it's like it's a crazy balance. And I
Yeah.
think you've hit on this a couple times that like the story's kind of about that balance. How
Yeah.
far do you go in your drive? How far do you go to lie and manipulate? How far do you go in telling a story that's real but also entertaining?
Right.
So a lot of stuff about construction going on simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really well said. Um, and I think if Cosby Rerun had written this Katie's story in the way that you
Mm,
suggested, that would have uh, gotten across um, Haley's intelligence to a much greater degree
sure.
because she would have been showing us how manipulative and how cunning she actually is. That would have been a great way to show it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
Yeah. One trend in the community I wasn't consciously aware of before reading the story, but I knew about, I just never thought about.
Hmm.
It's honestly dumb to me and makes no sense. Is
I love
females only being able to giggle for laughter instead of the huge range of laughter types, including chuckling,
it.
laughing, guffawing, wheezing, the list goes on. They only giggle, and that was such a huge trend for so long, and I never thought about it until I read this story.
Yeah. I don't even know if it's like a trend, so to speak, as it is like
A
a
trope?
key aspect of yeah, a trope of wedgie fish fiction, one of our defining characteristics, up there with a lack of consequences
Yeah.
and like a movement in some ways towards like, or I guess this like separation between stories very much focused on psychology and then stories going the other way as maybe a response to that, and just focusing on pure entertainment and wedgies, and not exploring any of those deeper questions and how we maybe bridge that gap as a community. But yeah, giggling is so prevalent in
Yeah.
stories, and it still is to this day.
Yep.
And I mean, as a writer working on stuff now, today, after like a decade of doing this, all my characters are still giggling all the time,
Yeah.
all the women. And it's weird. And like, and even in male stories, you'll see dudes giggling in wedgie stories. And you're like, and you're right. And I imagine you looking at like a list of laughter types and seeing how there's many others. And yeah, like there's little things like that you pick up on as you read them, and you're like, why is everyone giggling? Why is it like they're watching a movie and then the wedgie talk happens? Like that's a little like tropey and stuff in this story. You see that it hits on some of those tropes, which, and then I same to the point where I'm making, maybe it's deliberate. Maybe she's trying to make a point. Like she's taking these tropes and creating like a story around them,
Mm.
where she's like, what would be in a wedgie story? I'm Haley. I'm narcissistic. I want to create an awesome story with me in it. Oh, I gotta have girls giggling. I'm smart. I know I gotta have that. Like,
I,
is it crafted? Maybe.
that's
Maybe
very
not. Oh.
interesting that it may be because she's the one writing it. It could be like because her type and what she's interested in is very feminine
Yeah.
and introverted girls. Giggling is a very feminine thing to do.
Yeah.
Maybe that affects
I
it,
like it.
but
I like that.
it's
That could
also
be it.
it's also
Maybe
so
just
many
just
other
didn't have a
people.
word for it.
There's also
Yeah.
there's
It's
just
it's true.
too many
Yeah.
other
You're right.
people, too many other writers just have all of their
Yeah.
characters giggling and nothing else. So
Yeah.
it's hard to
It's
think of it
true.
as
Yeah.
differently for this
Yeah.
story.
You're right. You're certainly right. Giggling, and in Cosby reruns other stories, you see giggling come up.
You see it in
Like in,
basically every story.
yeah, Dear Journal is another one they did before a Sadistic, and there's some giggling there and things. So,
Yeah,
yeah, you're right. It's so prevalent.
yeah.
I mean, I feel like maybe it's tapping into a bit of that childishness of the
Hmm.
fetish and how it's like, and I talk about that a lot. We don't have to digress into this, but maybe that's partly it. It's like it's this thing that's like kind of associated with like I don't know, like high school girls, 18-year-olds, they're giggling, so let's put that in and try to build a realism, you know. So maybe that's the original insight behind it, but certainly so much giggling.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, and
You're right to point it
to
out.
be clear, giggling by itself is fine. Characters can giggle all they want,
Yeah.
but the only laughter that ever happens in the story is giggling. That's
Yes.
when it's annoying, and that is the trope
Good
of
distinction.
so
Yeah.
many stories.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So true.
yeah,
Yes. Good point. Thank you. Yeah. Good point.
yeah. And it's one I didn't think about before. Like when I asked you any tropes that came up, I thought of that after the fact. I was like, oh, I wish I would have brought
It's
that up
just a
during.
giggling. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's so prevalent. I
yeah,
mean, the more you look, the more you're gonna find little things like that. I say little because they're so present, you don't even think about them. Like they're
exactly.
just something that's in all the stories.
Yeah.
Kind of like if you said knives are in slashers or something. Like there's clearly more evident and kind of like tropes that you're gonna look at, but like there's gonna be the small things like giggling that just there we gloss over them at a certain
Hmm.
point because we
Yeah.
see them so frequently. So I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah.
Yeah, the things that we don't think about, but the only way you would pick up on them is to do an analytical approach, like how we have been tackling stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, as a call to the community, stop having all your characters only giggle.
Great.
But
Great call to
anyway,
action.
anyway,
Yeah, I love it. Thank you.